Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. For this week's program, I'd like to talk about what we're hearing in the news every night. News about the Trump indictment. Before we get into it, I just want to say that evil's being exposed, righteousness is being vindicated, and evil men are being judged. Everything is going according to the plan, God's plan. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 24, the Lord of hosts has sworn, saying, surely, just as I've intended, so it has happened, and just as I have planned, so it will stand. For the Lord of hosts has planned, and who can frustrate it? And for his outstretched hand, who can turn it back? And that wasn't just a reference to good things, but the rise and the fall of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. The Trump indictments are doing exactly what God wants done in this world. What might that be? What might be some of the lessons we can learn from all this? Well, first, let's not assume that everyone is on the same page as to what the Trump indictments mean. Let's break it down into three possible opinions. First, those who would say that the Trump indictments are good because evil President Trump is finally getting his comeuppance. Justice is being done in the world, and that would be the opinion of the Democrat left. I'm sure those on the religious left would believe that the verses in Psalms that referred to the wicked reaping what they have sown would apply to Trump. Psalm chapter 7, verse 14, behold, he travails with wickedness, and he conceives mischief and brings forth falsehood. He has dug a pit and hollowed it out and has fallen into the hole which he has made. His mischief will return upon his own head. And that text they would apply to President Trump. And we see this often, how one's worldview determines how one defines who is the wicked and who are the righteous. In the Psalms, the left would see the conservatives as the wicked Pharisees with all of their rules, and they would see themselves as followers of Jesus. As in this book, Jesus was a liberal. And so how does someone know who is who? Is the Bible so ambiguous that it can be used by both sides? No, the way to be able to apply the Bible correctly is to read the whole book and not just take the word wicked and righteous out of a verse and apply it to whoever you want. Well, anyway, a second opinion would be Trump was a good president, but he is reaping the consequences of his own dysfunctional behavior. Indictment number 1, paying hush money because he allegedly committed adultery with a porn star. Indictment number 2, taking and hiding classified documents. Indictment number 3, allegedly fomenting the January 6th protests by claiming the election was stolen, a protest the left is calling an insurrection. And indictment number 4, Trump called Georgia's Secretary of State, pressuring him to find more votes. So in this opinion, the lesson would be that if you are a righteous civil leader, you have to be squeaky clean. No skeletons in your closet, otherwise the enemy can get a handle on you. Such as King David. He gave his enemies a huge foothold when he committed adultery with Bathsheba. So this second assessment of the situation, in this, Trump is still getting what he deserves. He made his bed, now he has to sleep in it. And this would be the opinion of people like Mike Pence or the never Trumpers on the Republican side. They would say, I told you so. This is what you get for having a playboy president. And finally, the third assessment would be that Trump is an innocent victim in all this. These are trumped up charges. Excuse the pun. To either get rid of Trump or just as vindictive payback. What Trump is being accused of, the Democrats do all the time. the Democrat prosecutors and the media are blatant partisan hypocrites. They are really not morally outraged by Trump's actions. It's just a pretext to take Trump down. They've been looking for something to indict Trump on, and they've twisted the meaning of the law to do it. Isaiah chapter 29, for the ruthless will come to an end, and the scorner will be finished. Indeed, all those who are intent on doing evil will be cut off. And what do these people do? Verse 21, they cause a person to be indicted by a word and ensnare him who adjudicates at the gate and defraud the one in the right with meaningless arguments. Trump opponents will say, Trump, you asked Raffensperger to find votes, and in our book, that's political pressure. Or you asked Zelensky to investigate Hunter Biden's corrupt dealings in the Ukraine, and to us, that's a political witch hunt. And Trump, you said that there are good people on both sides, and for us, that's racism. They cause a person to be indicted by a word. And if Trump is being targeted by the wicked, and there are many evil, unprincipled actors in politics, many of the Psalms would then apply to President Trump. Psalm 25:19, look upon my enemies, for they are many, and they hate me with a violent hatred. Psalm 35:7, for without cause they hid their net for me. Without cause they dug a pit for my soul. Psalm 35:19, do not let those who are wrongfully my enemies rejoice over me, nor let those who hate me without cause wink maliciously. They open their mouth wide against me. They say, aha, aha, our eyes have seen it. So Psalm 35:21 is what we would call in our day a gotcha moment, where the enemy constantly examines their opponent's every word and actions, looking for something to discredit them. Did you ever experience that? If not, you will. Psalm 59, deliver me from my enemies, O my God, and set me securely on high, away from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from those who do iniquity, and save me from men of bloodshed. For behold, they have set an ambush for my life. Fierce men launch an attack against me, not for my transgressions, not for my sin, O Lord. Now, this brings up a very fascinating aspect of David's life and testimony, one that most people are not aware of. And I guarantee you, you will run into this personally. This is a crucial Bible study lesson here. David's enemies indicted David because of his commitment of adultery with Bathsheba. But David and God knew that the accusations coming from David's opponents were not because of David's adultery. Their agenda was to take down David so they could secure for themselves David's power. For example, Psalm 69, those who hate me without cause are more than the hairs of my head. Those who would destroy me are powerful, being wrongfully my enemies. What I did not steal, I then had to restore. But then notice the next verse, Psalm 69:5. O God, it is you who know my folly, and my wrongs are not hidden from you. So David acknowledged his own faults, but he could still say that his enemies hated him without cause, and his enemies are still wrongfully his enemies. David understood that his personal failures weren't the reason for his persecutors. They hated David because they wanted his office. They hated his righteous position on many issues. Psalm 35:7, for without cause they have hid their net for me. Without cause they dug a pit for my soul. So back to Psalm 69. Psalm 69 is a messianic psalm. It starts off talking about David's persecutors, but ends up talking about Christ's persecutors. Remember, in the New Testament, Psalm 69 is quoted in reference to Christ. Verse 9, "For the zeal for your house has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me." So how can there be a comparison between David's persecutors and Christ's persecutors? David was a terrible sinner, and it seemed like he was just reaping what he has sown. Well, God's people will sin, but our persecutors aren't really persecuting us for that. They're annoyed by our moral worldview. They're jealous of our blessing. Now, for Christ, in that unbelievers persecuted him, even though he was completely innocent, showed that their persecutions weren't really about a desire for justice. In Psalm 38, David prays a prayer of repentance because of his sin with Bathsheba. This is one of those great psalms of repentance like Psalm 32 and Psalm 51. Psalm 38:4, "For my iniquities have gone over my head. As a heavy burden, they weigh too much for me. My wounds grow foul and fester because of my folly." But then notice what David says about his enemies in verse 20. "They oppose me because I follow what is good." So it had nothing to do with David's moral failure. Of course, David's enemies would list all of David's moral failures, so it would sound like they were against him for righteous reasons. But David knew otherwise. He understood the game that was being played. He wasn't naive like some voters are today, actually believing the accusations of the enemy. So here's a way of looking at it. David was able to separate between the two issues: his sin versus the agenda of his opponents. He understood that his sin really had nothing to do with the enemy's persecutions. Therefore, his enemies were guilty before God for unjustly persecuting the righteous, even though David wasn't perfect and had moral failures. David didn't fall into a very common trap where a righteous man ends up with false guilt and giving way to the wicked. Proverbs 25:26, "Like a trampled spring and a polluted well is a righteous man who gives way before the wicked." So that the righteous man says, "Listen, I've done something wrong. I need to step down. I need to give up. I have overdue library books. I have a misdemeanor for unpaid parking tickets." The question is often, do I have to be perfect in order to find comfort in any of these psalms about being persecuted for righteousness' sake? No, you don't. David wasn't perfect, but he could still recognize and condemn his enemies. Now this gets really deep because we all know dysfunctional people who complain that they're being persecuted for righteousness' sake, when really all of their troubles are due to their own faults. And we have the injunctions in 1 Peter that we have no right to complain when we suffer for our own moral failures. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 20. "For what credit is there if when you sin, you're harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what's right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God." 1 Peter 4:15, "Make sure that none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a troublesome meddler." You see, one of the excuses a sinner will always use is victimization. I'm being persecuted unfairly, like Cain said in Genesis chapter 4. As soon as a politician is caught in a bribe, he will claim that this is a political hit job because I'm of a certain party. So we need to watch out for that. That when we're indicted by others for our sins, that we don't immediately claim we're being persecuted for righteousness' sake. But there are many cases in which even in our faults and even in our lack of discretion, our enemies persecute us unjustly, and they use our faults as a pretext against us. We especially see that it's a pretext when they commit the same sins themselves or when they tolerate it in their own party. We sin, but the enemy takes it further, like in Zechariah chapter 1, verse 15. This situation may happen to us at work, in the neighborhood, in our family, even in marriage. You forget to take out the trash, but as far as your spouse is concerned, you're a psychopathic narcissist for your neglect because your spouse has another agenda, which has nothing to do with the trash. And you can't do anything right, and everything you do that is wrong is exaggerated because your opponent has an agenda. The King David case is a warning to those who are quick to judge others for their failure. If you condemn the righteous for their failures, you may be putting yourself under the judgment of God. So there you have it. 3 possible views concerning Trump's indictments. Number 1, Trump is an evil man who is finally getting justice. Number 2, Trump is a good man who's being taken down by his own faults. Number 3, Trump is a man being persecuted for righteousness' sake. So which is the right view? And there really is a right view based upon godly discernment. Let me just suggest it's somewhere between the second and the third view. Yes, Trump has his faults. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 20. Indeed, there is not a righteous man on earth who continually does good and never sins. But what we're seeing in the Trump indictments is a political witch hunt. And most of the public realizes this. So let's take a few moments now and review the indictments. I even have difficulty keeping it all straight. And looking at all of these indictments, it's pretty clear that they're fabricated for partisan political reasons. So the first indictment came in March of this year. A grand jury in New York indicted Trump for falsifying business records. This is not a federal case. This is a New York case. The Democrats in New York wanted to find a way to indict Trump. Trump paid porn actress Stormy Daniels $130,000 to keep quiet about an affair she alleged to have had with Trump. Trump denies the encounter, but she blackmailed him in this regard, and he considered it better to pay her than to have the accusation out there. Now, if we were living in the 19th century, a grand jury could have indicted Trump on the basis of adultery, but that law is no longer on the books. And now it's not illegal to pay someone hush money. It's done in business all the time. The prosecutor is trying to get Trump because rather than disclosing it as a campaign expense, he disclosed it as a business expense. And that's it. He's being indicted on multiple charges for falsifying records because his accountant put the expense in the wrong column. I have a degree in accounting, and I would even have considered it a business expense. Now, it may have some bearing on his campaign, but everything someone does in his personal life has a bearing on the campaign. But it's not all campaign expense. And nobody at the IRS, the New York State Department of Revenue, or the FEC had any problem with this when it was filed. But Democrat prosecutors were looking for some way to indict Trump. How many counts are there in this indictment? 34. And this is ridiculous. They're throwing every possible conspiracy accusation against Trump, hoping that something will stick. They're trying to make it sound like this was a heinous, seditious act against the United States. The next indictment came in July. The Department of Justice, with Special Prosecutor Jack Smith, indicted Trump on 37 felony counts for allegedly taking classified documents, the documents from his time in the White House. I found this indictment really bizarre. Pence, Biden, and other politicians have also taken home classified documents. And every president takes his documents. And presidents actually have the authority to declassify their documents. For what reason would they want to take these documents? As mementos? Maybe they plan to start a presidential library. I would have imagined that Trump would have played it smart and just given them everything they wanted so that they would have no excuse to prosecute him. So something else is going on here that the public isn't being told. The next indictment was on August 1st. Jack Smith and the DOJ indicted Trump for the J6 protest. That because Trump doubted the outcome of the election, he was responsible for the Capitol break-in. And this indictment will result in a constitutional crisis over the right to free speech and the right to political speech. If Trump loses this case, no politician will ever again be able to question the outcome of an election and call for an investigation, because now it will be considered telling a lie. That is, if it turns out that the election was legitimate. What the prosecutor, Jack Smith, is actually claiming is that any statement made by a politician that Jack Smith believes is false is not covered as free speech under the First Amendment. This is the political weaponization of the Justice Department, where a political party uses law enforcement to go after their political opponents, to prosecute those who don't agree with you by alleging that those who don't agree with you are stirring up social unrest. The DOJ has indicted at least 18 other unnamed people along with Trump, calling them co-conspirators because they're alleged to be involved in racketeering, a conspiracy to overthrow the government. Well, you can make that case against any political party that's campaigning to remove the party in power. The final indictment came from the state of Georgia last week. A Democrat prosecutor in Georgia, Fannie Willis, indicted Trump on election meddling because after the election, Trump called Brad Raffensperger, Georgia's Secretary of State, and asked him to look into election corruption in his state and see if he could find any missing votes. As if to ask for that was criminal political pressure. So I guess now if you ask someone to look into corruption, you are corrupt. And the Georgia indictment is really using the same legal theory as Jack Smith with the DOJ. That if you question the election and ask for an investigation, you're a criminal because nobody is allowed to question a Democrat win. So this is sheer political partisanship. Now, we have to realize something else in all this. Not only are the Democrats running the DOJ, prosecuting Trump, but they're not prosecuting Joe Biden. They are hunting for Trump's crimes and avoiding Biden's obvious crimes of influence peddling and foreign payments. Here's a statement from one of Trump's lawyers.
The fact that I am standing here for the third time in 5 months is not a coincidence. This is the Biden political lawfare that we have seen time and time again. It is a deflection from everything that they have done. And if you don't believe me, look at the facts. On March 17th, Hunter accidentally admits that it was his laptop from hell. The next day, DA Alvin Bragg indicts President Trump. June 8th, an FBI document is released showing that the Ukrainians paid the Biden crime family millions and millions of dollars. The next day, the Mar-a-Lago raid. and the Mar-a-Lago indictment. Last week, Hunter Biden's sweetheart plea deal fell through when the judge realized it had blanket immunity. The following day, a superseding indictment against Donald Trump. July 31st, Devin Archer goes to testify in front of the House. That was only after they failed to put him in jail prior to the fact. What happens the next day? The January 6th indictment that we're here for today. This is not a coincidence. This is election interference at its finest against the leading candidate right now for president, for either party. President Trump is under siege in a way that we have never seen before. President Trump and his legal team and everyone on his team will continue to fight, not for him, but for the American people.
So it sure looks like a cover-up to distract the public from their own crimes. Now, for the rest of the time, I'd like to discuss how this will all backfire on the Democrats. For the first part of this program, we looked into this whole issue of motives and guilt. What are legitimate accusations and what are false accusations coming from the enemies of righteousness? But the second part of this discussion is about how these indictments will hurt the Democrats. Even though at first it doesn't seem like these indictments will. I mean, obviously the Democrats believe that this will help them, otherwise they wouldn't be indicting Trump. But biblically, every time you dig a pit for someone, you fall into it. Guaranteed. This is a 100% unbreakable principle. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 27. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone, it will come back on him. Proverbs 28:10. He who leads the upright astray in the evil way will himself fall into his own pit, but the blameless will inherit good. It's kind of like the old story of the coyote and the roadrunner. In this sense, we need to appreciate how these indictments against President Trump will actually be turned around for the good of the righteous. I do remember that Romans chapter 8, verse 28 is still in the Bible. We know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And this is not only referring to those things that are positive, righteous events. This also includes the machinations of the wicked. The devil, when he shoots at us, always shoots himself in the foot. Now, we're all amazed by the left's denial of election fraud. But stop and think for a moment how the shoe could be on the other foot if and when a Democrat loses. Where the left claims election fraud in order to delegitimize the conservative candidate who won, to sow doubt to the authority of the conservative candidate in the eyes of the public, so there'd be a black cloud over his entire administration. This would give the media something to talk about to discredit the conservative candidate throughout his term. Just like they kept the Russian collusion hoax going for most of Trump's term. And when that failed, they tried to use Trump's phone call with President Zelensky. They were always looking for something to discredit Trump because they wanted the power of the White House, and they wanted their abortion and their government largesse and their socialism. The first thing Biden did when he got into office was fund all sorts of leftist social organizations. If the left uses the election fraud tactic, they could run constant reports of election fraud. They could get the support of YouTube and Google and Twitter and Facebook. If the left loses an election, the left running social media would not consider accusations of election fraud to be a threat to democracy or a threat to peace. They would consider it a civic duty. legitimate reporting, legitimate political speech. And when Trump won back in 2016, there were plenty of people on the left claiming that the election was illegitimate, that he was not their president, and that they would practice civil disobedience against him. So if a conservative president ever wins in the future, there is a real possibility that the Democrat playbook would be to allege election fraud. But now, because of all of the left's defense of election integrity, and because of all of their indictments against anyone who alleges election fraud, that tactic has been taken off their table. They can no longer play that game. They will never again be able to claim election fraud if they lose, well, not very easily. And they can never use protest or charge any government building in civil disobedience, with riots, with sit-ins, because they'll be doing the very thing that they said was anti-democratic, that they said was illegitimate political speech. That was something done by the evil President Trump. But historically, that kind of civil disobedience has been the playbook of the left when they can't get their way. This is a Saul Alinsky rule for radicals. You know, they know that the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and that the one thing politicians hate the most is public disruption. And they will go along with just about anything to keep the peace. But all of that is off the table for the left in the future because of what they've done to Donald Trump. And that's a good thing, and that's the providence of God, to indict the left if they ever resort to those tactics in the future. By the way, if the Republicans ever want to cheat an election, given the current environment, they could probably get away with it today. Now, I know what you're thinking. It doesn't matter. The left doesn't care about being hypocritical. Without any reservation, they will do exactly what they have indicted the Republicans for doing. The left will practice a bold-faced double standard. They'll flip-flop on the issue, claiming there are new circumstances that are different from the 2020 election. I get that. But still, it will not be easy for the Democrats to do. They can't do it without exposing their hypocrisy. They will be called out relentlessly for their double standard. And that's God's purpose, to expose evil. And that exposing does sway independent voters. It does wake up the public. So here's the principle. Proverbs 26:27. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone, it will come back on him. Those who live in glass houses ought not to throw stones. You can't have it both ways. Promoting injustice and then expecting justice to be applied to you. Let me clarify something here. I'm not saying that the penalty for the left will simply be that they will never be able to claim election fraud, never be able to riot. It's more than that. Additionally, their indictments will be used against them. The way they have twisted the law will someday be used against them. Just like in the French Revolution, Robespierre, the instigator, was eventually sent to the gallows by the very ideology he inspired in the revolutionaries. The same thing happened to the original supporters of communism. The system they set up was then used against them. If you dig a pit for others, you are digging a pit for yourself. Here are just 3 of many biblical examples. The first is probably what immediately comes to your mind, the book of Esther. Haman hung on the gallows that he made for Mordecai. Haman, an Agite, an anti-Semite, has the king of Persia pass a law to destroy a group of people that he claimed were subverting the Persian government by their disagreement with Persian law. He had in mind the Jews. But little did Haman realize that the very concept he was promoting, unquestioning loyalty to government, would be used against him. When it was discovered that Haman was the one actually subverting the empire to his own gain. And in the end, Haman's attempt to destroy the Jews actually strengthened government protection of the Jews. Just like Democrats today, Haman thought there was no way he would be found out, that there was no way his law would be used against him, but be sure your sin will find you out. The second example is Daniel. Daniel chapter 6. Daniel was a righteous politician in Babylon under the new Persian Empire, but the other bureaucrats had it out for Daniel. Why? We're not given a reason. It simply stated that they tried but couldn't find any grounds of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they were trying. Now, in the context, it was likely jealousy. They wanted the power and position of Daniel. Just like the Pharisees crucified Jesus out of jealousy. But there was probably also a moral element where the officials didn't like the righteous standards or the financial accountability Daniel was imposing because these officials were corrupt. Jealousy and lawlessness often go together. So these commissioners got Darius, the king, to sign a law prohibiting religious freedom under the guise of promoting loyalty to the state. They didn't expose the king to the real intended consequences of their legislation, that is, to persecute their opponent Daniel. Daniel chapter 6, verse 7, all the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors, have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man beside you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document. So they changed the law in order to dig a pit for Daniel. What happened? Daniel's arrested. He's thrown into the lion's den. When the punishment doesn't destroy Daniel, the king then throws Daniel's opponents into the lion's den because they were the ones who were discovered to actually be disloyal to the state. Daniel 6:24, the king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them and their children and their wives into the lion's den. Does this happen today? Yes, all the time. In many different circumstances and in many different ways, if you dig a pit for others, God will make sure you fall into it. The third example is the prophet Jeremiah. The false prophets and the elders of Israel who are unfaithful to God accused Jeremiah of going over to the side of the Babylonians, accused him of treason and disloyalty, and they had him arrested and imprisoned. That's all recorded in Jeremiah 37. But by doing this, it put the elders of Israel into a situation where they would have egg on their face if they ever decided that it would be good policy to surrender to the Babylonians to at least save the city from complete destruction. Their accusations against Jeremiah set themselves up for their own destruction because they stubbornly had to save face in the light of what they accused Jeremiah of. Their accusations against Jeremiah caused the elders of Israel to be all the more adamant not to submit to the Babylonians. So their false accusations against Jeremiah became part of their undoing. Could it be that the left's Russian collusion hoax that made Putin out to be a boogeyman and that Russia was trying to subvert American elections and keep Hillary out of office, could it be that that hoax contributed to the current adamant Democratic support for Zelensky and Ukraine in opposition to Russia? I think so. To what degree, we may never know, but God is working out his judgments. So in Jeremiah 39, when the Babylonian army started to break through the wall of Jerusalem, the elders of Israel tried to sneak out of the city. They were caught and slaughtered. The very thing they falsely accused Jeremiah of doing, they did by being disloyal to Jerusalem, not standing up against the enemy, and sneaking out of the city to escape the siege. The very pit or accusation they made against Jeremiah became the grounds of their own condemnation. Remember this guy? Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader under President Obama. In 2013, with the Democrats in power, he changed the Senate rules so that a filibuster could no longer be used against president appointments, such as appointments to the Supreme Court. Little did Reid realize that with this change, in just 4 years, the Senate Republicans, having a slight majority under Trump, they would then be able to confirm all of Trump's justices to the Supreme Court. Harry Reid, in thinking he was sticking it to the Republicans, in doing away with the filibuster, made possible the overturning of Roe last year. And this is how the world works. Because there is a God who is on the throne, who will always thwart the plotting of the wicked, using their plotting to expose their sin and using it for the good of the righteous. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 19. He is the one who catches, or rather thwarts, the wise in their craftiness. This is a quote from Job chapter 5, verse 13. He captures the wise by their own shrewdness, and the advice of the cunning is quickly thwarted. Isaiah chapter 8, verse 10. Devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand, for God is with us. So also in the case of these Trump indictments. It may seem bad, but someday soon it will come back on the heads of these Democrats and work for the good of God's people. The key for us is to have the faith to believe Romans 8:28, that righteousness wins in the end. Now, this doesn't mean that we should sit back and not point out the constitutional error and try to deal with this legally. No, we're supposed to do our part in the providence of God. But still, in all this, we need to have confidence that it's going to work for our good. And we need to add to our conversation a reminder to these unprincipled men that this is going to come back upon their own heads. Now, as far as President Trump is concerned, or if this happens to any of us, remember, never back down or give way to the accusations of the enemy. Our reaction to false accusations is crucial to winning the battle. As God told the prophet Jeremiah, they will attack you, but don't give in to them or they will win. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 17. Now gird up your loins and arise and speak to them that all that I command you. Do not be dismayed before them, or I will dismay you before them. Don't let what happened to Michael Flynn happen to you. Remember Michael Flynn? He was chosen by President Trump to be Trump's national security advisor right when Trump got into office. But the left didn't like Flynn because he didn't play along with the system. So they made up a charge against Flynn that he called and talked to the Russian ambassador to the United States before Flynn actually stepped into the office of security advisor, as if he was representing the United States without actually having the office. And the left said that this was such a violation of U.S. law, yet cabinet members do this all the time. And no one has ever been charged with this crime because it's really not a crime. Trump was new to office, and Trump believed what these insiders were saying, so he asked Flynn to step down. They put Flynn on trial and forced Flynn to plead guilty in order to take a plea deal. The whole thing was one big lie, and everyone today recognizes this. So when your enemy digs a pit for you, don't ever think it's a legitimate pit that you've created by your own doing. Don't believe their lies. Don't give way before the wicked. Well, there's a whole lot more to be said about the Trump indictments. There's so much biblical godly wisdom to learn from this event, but I have to end somewhere. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. Subscribe, like, share. Leave a comment below. Be strong in the faith, and may Jesus Christ reign.